really great. And we move to the last but not least presentation that will be done by Jos Streng, transport policy advisor of the city of Rotterdam, and Jos will drive us into this pioneering city in moving to zero emission logistics zone in Rotterdam. I had the pleasure to work with Jos in developing the policy analysis joint document on transition to zero emission logistics a couple of years ago. And thank you for sharing that time the insights on this initiative. You were starting that time, and now it's in the medium term. So then, really looking forward to your presentation, Jos, and the updates. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando, and welcome everyone. Of course, I'm pleased as well to be a speaker in this webinar. And to make sure that we don't run out of time, I'm the last speaker. I'll ask Pablo, my much appreciated assistance, to shift to the next slide, please. Okay, so a bit of policy, local policy background. We have an urban traffic plan, sustainable urban traffic plan, with a strategy to reduce as far as possible the transport of goods, or to make it more efficient, and then change the modality, and as long as it's motorized, change that to zero emission vehicles. And we have some general documents on mobility, and logistics is is a part of that. So please, the next slide. Here you see the basic principle of the shift we're making in the SUMP, in the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plan. So where it used to be preference in policy matters for motorized vehicles, especially passenger cars, and the active travel modes like cycling and walking at the subordinated position, that's been inverted in the Rotterdam mobility approach. And actually, me and my colleagues, we have some 6 persons working on city logistics. Next slide, please, Pablo. We try to make this shift, take it even further, and you can see that in cycling, we know that cycle logistics can play an important part in making city logistics more sustainable. And of course, we, let's see, me and my colleagues, we are advocates of giving priority to logistics over motorized individual vehicles. So the passenger car is actually at the bottom of the pyramid. Next one, please. So the coal single is more or less an illustration of the type of street we'd like to develop in Rotterdam, with most of the room for the preferred mobility modes. So that's pedestrians, cyclists, public transport, and then very modest part allocated to individual or shared passenger cars. And of course, as soon as possible, all these should be without emission. Next slide, please. Well, then we have made our definition of sustainability in city logistics as specific and concrete as possible. And of course, it should be achievable and understandable for stakeholders. And there I mean both shippers and transporters, but also receivers, both consumers and businesses. And then, well, as you can see, we have 3 components of this definition. So that's a minimum of environmental impact, maximum efficiency, and there the use of urban space, of course, is one important reason why the city is making an effort to influence city logistics at city level. And then, of course, another important principle we use is that we only regulate, or we try to regulate as much as possible with input and feedback from stakeholders and involvement by stakeholders. And for instance, Marie-José Baartmans, her company is one of the companies that have really supported the development of our policies, and also, of course, have provided constructive criticism. Next slide, please. Here we have, let's say, 4 main angles from which we try to achieve the policy goals, the targets. So sharing resources, space, vehicles, chargers. There are subsidies already mentioned by Sonja. We have a limited number of, limited amount, you could say, of subsidy resources at local level. Most of it is provided at national level. Now we already focused on charging infrastructure. I can say a few more things later on. And one important thing you see in the bottom right, leading by example. We think that we should practice as much as possible what we preach. So our own fleet of duty vehicles is trying to be a front runner. Of course, we're not as far ahead as Breitner, but that's also, of course, because we have a lot of different type of very complicated vehicles, which are not all that easy to make zero emission. Next one, please. So this is our basic policy document dating back from 2019, the roadmap for zero emission city logistics. These are available in English for knowledge exchange with other cities abroad. Next one, please. And well, the very, let's say, the most important step in this roadmap is the introduction of the zero emission zone, which you see depicted here. And as you can see, it's a very large zone. It's about 40 square kilometers, and it's surrounded by the ring of national highways surrounding the city. Next one, please. This you've seen as well. This is the introduction scheme, so I think we can transition scheme. We can skip this one. And here we have 9 solutions, so ways of changing the way we use vehicles, space, and other resources, which are promoted to reach the goal of zero emission city logistics by 2030 within the zone. And we distinguish 6 segments, and sometimes we find that this is not refined enough. Well, I'll try to recap a little. So we have 9 solutions, and we distinguish 6 different segments. Sometimes this is enough. Sometimes we can even combine measures for certain segments, and sometimes we find that we need to distinguish a little more, make more distinctions in developing regulations and doing pilots. Next one, please. It was already mentioned, of course, if we need to be ready in 2030, then we need to be sure that we're on the right path. So at a local level as well, you saw the national figures. We're trying to match this at local level using traffic monitoring and automatic number plate recognition techniques to see how the percentage of vehicles is evolving. And so far, we can see it's not going fast enough. We're a bit above the national average, which of course is not a miracle if you listen to Marie-José, for instance. We're very happy to have them in our region. But one of the things we foresee also in the charging aspect is we're not with a linear progression. We're really on the bottom curve, which means that just before 2030, we expect, especially with the heavy duty vehicles, that there's going to be a very huge increase, which has to be both supplied by the OEMs, and also the grid has to, of course, provide the available capacity. So we are really very busy, and we're also actively participating in the national coordination groups to make sure that we have a smooth and uniform or harmonized transition in all the 30 zero emission zone cities. Next one, please. And then 3 policy pillars. Please continue. First, suitable space. Next one, please. So one thing we need to do, we think, is include logistic requirements in urban development. So whenever a project developer is building a new project, we try to introduce as early as possible ask of them a logistics plan for the construction stage. So there's construction logistics, but also for the build stage, when the is being exploited. Then we need to be sure that as much as possible, the logistic functioning of the new project takes place as much as possible on private space, so that public space can remain available for the other users, which is increasingly scarce. We need to provide logistics space, so a sufficient part of the business parks, commercial spaces need to be available for logistics, and we try to anchor this in the spatial planning document. We'll see a picture of that later on. And then, of course, there's the traffic management aspect of making sure that logistic traffic gets to their destination and can pick up the garbage, for instance, in an efficient way, but also making sure that vulnerable parts of the city are not burdened too much by the externalities. And which we're preparing with our colleagues of traffic management experiments with prioritizing trucks at intersections at specific parts of the city or routes, and also specific times of day. Next one, please. And then we have some R&D topics, of course, for getting to our goals as fast as possible. You see them listed here. One thing I'd like to stress here is the third point, demand management. We think that so far we have not advanced very much in gaining insight in how we can use the stimulate receivers, so ordering behavior and cooperation of retailers and consumers to make the supply chain more sustainable. Well, here you see, as I already announced, a map from the spatial planning document, in which it's a bit small, but you can see there's a black circle with a van inside, and that's specifically denominated as searching area for development of logistic functions in the areas. Next one, please. Yes, you can skip this as community building. So we have a large community which is counting about 2,500 companies and organizations in and around Rotterdam. They're active in Rotterdam with their transports. And actually, we're having a meeting upcoming this week, and we're very busy in preparing that. Please go to the next one. So we have a newsletter, a website, and events, as I announced, and Plugin 010. That's the current name of that type of event. And then the third is the personal approach of individual stakeholders. Here we see our brokers. They are working for the so-called EcoStars program, and they consult on request and for free with companies and organizations. They prepare them for what's going to happen, the introduction of the zone, what it means for their company, how they can seek advice and also support, either financial or otherwise, both at national level and sometimes locally. And one interesting point is, and it's quite successful, is the last point, a free tryout arrangement of electric vans, light electric freight vehicles, and cargo bikes, because this practical experience is very supportive. We notice of companies and organizations adapting the new type of transport and doing it in time, so to meet access requirements. Yeah, and that's actually the last slide as well, in which I think what's gets our attention most these days, and our upcoming meeting is also focused on that, is to make sure that everyone involved knows what's going to happen, so that they can prepare in time to change their. Of course, we've done this before, but we're trying now, especially to reach the very small companies, so not the SME, but the very small enterprises, um, and to make sure that they know what's going to happen, and that we also know the type of difficulties they encounter, so that we can tailor our support activity, our flanking policy to that need. And that was my story, so I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Jos, for the presentation. And meantime, we retrieve questions from the audience through the chat, or people that want to raise their hand. I I have one question myself for you, because I have been quite informed on all your efforts in Rotterdam and the process since 2018, I guess. Now you are in the middle of this journey, and at that moment when you started, you were a pioneer, and now continue to be pioneer, I think, but with a lot of more experience. So could you just share the main three learnings you go through the process, or the advice that you would like
Mm-hmm.
to sharpen a little bit, and also more looking what could be your expectation on logistics companies to speed up the process?
Yes, well, you're quite right. We're in the middle. I'm not really sure if we may be, let's say, a front runner, but certainly not the only one. So we have a very good exchange with other major cities in the Netherlands and also abroad. Um, but I think, at present, I already said in my presentation, it's quite important to divide your attention between stimulating front runners and informing and helping laggards, because in the end, you have to make sure that everyone can make the transition, or at least get the opportunity to make the transition in a fair way. On the other hand, city logistics, of course, cities are only a limited part of the country, and the transport is not only in the cities. It's a mix of both. So specifically for Alice, I would say, yeah, we are concerned that the vehicles may be the limiting factor, whereas in fact the transport in the cities may not have to take place using the very heavy vehicles. So that's one of the very important questions. Do we want the efficiency of large vehicles with let's say their disadvantages, versus many trips with smaller vehicles? Because that has implications for the space and also for the operations. But one of our messages, if we're just saying alarming things about trucks not being available in time, then from the city perspective, I always respond nowadays that, okay, but not every problem has to be solved by a one-on-one change of vehicles. There may be some other way in changing the operations, which of course is a transition, because it's very human to try and repeat what you've done. And if you have to change the vehicle, then I just do the same with electric vehicle. But that's not always the answer. It's not always necessary. And one other thing, I'm just answering this now because it takes up a lot of our time. We don't want to burden, let's say, private van owners. It's a very specific question. But we want to help, of course, the companies, because they need to change their vehicles. But then the politicians have said, okay, but private owners of a van, for instance, transporting people, handicapped people, they shouldn't be burdened by the introduction of the zone. But how can we make sure that we know that every van which enters the city is either zero emission, because if it's zero emission, there's no problem at all. But it may be a non-zero emission van, but it may be a privately owned and privately used van. So that's a very, let's say, it's not really a logistic problem, but it's quite important to, let's say, to get the acceptance of the introduction of the zone. So that's why I think it's important to have sufficient personnel capacity to make that we can introduce. So that's not, let's say, that's just let's say professional kind of thing. But the last thing I'd like to say is the clear definition of targets, and Marie-José has also stressed it from the beginning. Make sure as public authority which are your targets, and hold on to them. And this is, of course, it takes brave politicians, both at European level, at national level, and local level. And they may be helped, of course, by the apparatus of civil servants. That's an interaction. But I think that the companies, they usually do. I know from the Alice discussions as well that they are greatly helped by getting a clear perspective, especially also for the longer term. And this is, let's say, always difficult because we have these elections every 5 years or 4 years, or even shorter periods, which make it hard for politicians to take long-term, perhaps unpopular decisions. Has this raised any more questions, or are we just going to end in time?
Not that I can see. I see one summary proposed, and that it could be interesting to reflect on. And actually, it's also looking into what you said, and what Mario just said is that most of the times the innovation, or it's looking into the vehicle or the infrastructure, but not into the operations. But the way you operate these vehicles may be quite different. And there we don't see, particularly this a little fight we have the Commission that is not enabling a good framework for innovation on the logistics operations, really taking in consideration the conditions of operating these zero emission vehicles, the charging, all these operational things that were very nicely addressed by Marie-José, and that we're also saying that we have the vehicles, we'll have the infrastructure, but it's a multiplication of vehicles, infrastructure, and TCO. So if there is no TCO, there will be no happiness here.